The United States expands drone operations in Africa. The immediate goal is to provide surveillance for a French-led military operation in Mali. But drone strikes aren't being ruled out, and that could mean the same backlash against drone programs elsewhere. I'm Shirley Ghosh, you're with Inside Story. The US is opening up a new front against armed groups linked to al-Qaeda in Africa. Niger is reported to have given permission for US drones to be based in its territory. Outgoing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has said the US faces a serious threat from armed groups in the region. And this is what she's talking about. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and associated groups are spread across this swathe of sub-Saharan Africa. The 2011 war in Libya has left an array of heavily armed fighters ready for battle at home or beyond. Boko Haram fighters in Nigeria have carried out numerous attacks against Christians and churches. And Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army is active in the border region between South Sudan and the Central African Republic. The only permanent US base in Africa is in the eastern part of the continent in Djibouti. But it also has drone bases in Morocco, Burkina Faso, Uganda and Ethiopia. The latest one, planned for Niger, puts it right in the heart of this region. OK, so plenty to discuss with my guests today. Let me introduce them. In London, we have Robert Densmore, a former US naval flight officer and editor of Defence Report. In our Washington studios, David Shin, Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University and former US ambassador to Burkina Faso and Ethiopia. Also in our London News Centre, Noel Sharkey, Professor of Artificial Intelligence and Robotics at the University of Sheffield and Chairman of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Robert, let me start with you. How significant is this agreement between the US and Niger? What does it mean?
It's very significant. The Horn of Africa really has been the focus of Africa Command, or AFRICOM, operations over the past several years, particularly with drone surveillance or UAV surveillance. They've not really been able to expand westward into North Africa or the Maghreb. This would be crucial in giving them observation in areas like Mali or Niger, or even further west in Africa. So it's very significant.
So even though there are already bases in places like Djibouti and Burkina Faso and Ethiopia, you're saying that there is a need for one in Niger. Is this a question of range?
It is a question of range. It's a question of also air traffic control. I mean, there's the Seychelles, for example, is another large base under Africa Command that can reach places like Somalia. Djibouti is there, Ethiopia as well. But the range on most of the drones that are operating in that area are a little over 1,000 miles. And so reaching West Africa is not really possible unless you talk about establishing a flight circuit, really, of where drones can launch from one base and fly to another, land, receive repairs, fuels, etc., and then launch again to cover further distances.
Noel, you're the drone expert. These are going to be unarmed surveillance drones, is my understanding. Talk us through their role and what they can do.
Well, essentially, you've said what they can do. They can fly at different levels, like 30,000 feet or 10,000 feet, and they've got very, very high resolution cameras. They also have infrared sensing, so they can detect heat, and they can look and find out who's around and what they're doing.
So
but they can't
is it possible to hide from them? Can you shield yourself from them? Can you use the terrain to hide from them?
You could hide inside a building, for instance, and then it can use infrared detection to detect you, but it won't know who you are, it won't be able to identify you unless someone's seen you going into the building. And in fact, this is the reason why several mistakes have been made, because intelligence has said who's in the building has turned out not to be the person in the building, but yet they've detected their heat signature and attacked it anyway. So it is possible to hide, yes. You can even hide from heat seeking as well if you want. If you buy a tin foil, you can get this kind of aluminum sheet that's lined, and you can hide in underneath that.
You can hide in tinfoil.
Your heat signature.
I mean, that's
Yep,
fascinating because, of course, the
essentially.
Pentagon has said that these drones could potentially be armed, the ones coming out of the Niger base, and presumably they'd be used to target fighters in the same way that we've seen drones used in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Yeah, well, that's very worrying. But it depends on who's using them as well. I'm not sure who's going to be using them. I mean, most of the attacks in Somalia and the Yemen have been by the CIA. And that's not very good. And if it's the same people in Mali, that's pretty tragic, because they're expanding this kind of intelligence network all over Africa now. And really, there's nobody's at war in Africa at all. What you've got is a hunt for terrorists. And some human rights lawyers, quite a few of them now, are saying that this is not the laws of war. This is actually human rights law, and what we're doing is actually murder. And the CIA are civilians. So it depends on who's using the weapons and what they're using them for.
David, of course, I mean, this is, of course, the latest in a gradual expansion of US surveillance drones in Africa. There is a growing concern about various groups operating in that region.
Well, this is an expansion. There's no question about it. On the other hand, it's been made very clear so far that the purpose of these drones that apparently are going into Niger is for surveillance. It's not for drone missile strikes. And I would like to clarify one point concerning the previous use of surveillance out of Burkina Faso. That was actually being done by C-12 turboprop aircraft, not by drones. And in fact, my understanding is that operation had been shut down for concern that the C-12s might be shot down or the pilots captured while flying over Mali. So in effect, what's going into Niger seems to be replacing what was being done in Burkina Faso, but doing it more effectively. But I'd be a little bit leery about making a leap from going from surveillance drones to military strike drones. I don't think anyone is at that point yet.
OK, well, let's just take a look at the kind of events which have provoked this move. The US is expanding its drone operations at a time of heightened tension in North Africa. France is leading an offensive in Mali against al-Qaeda-inspired fighters. Gunmen attacked a gas plant in Algeria earlier this month, killing 35 foreign workers. And European governments have warned their citizens to leave the Libyan city of Benghazi, quoting an imminent threat against Westerners. David, how important is it to have more intelligence, to expand the intelligence operations coming out of this area? We know that US forces are already assisting the French offensive in Mali, don't we?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical to have additional intelligence, and I think drone surveillance is the most effective way to do it, and also the least risky in terms of jeopardizing lives of personnel. Now, it is going to require a much bigger military footprint in Niger than was the case for the C-12 operation in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, probably by a factor of 10 times or more. My understanding is it may take up to 300 personnel to operate and protect a drone surveillance operation in Niger. So you do have the added concern of a larger military footprint, but I think it's worth the risk.
Robert, David's saying there that we shouldn't be too hasty in making this leap from assuming that the surveillance drones are going to be turned into strike drones. Do you agree with that assessment? Because, I mean, obviously the use of strike drones is a whole different ballgame and very, very controversial.
No, it's academic. I mean, when you start talking about surveillance and reconnaissance missions, particularly with the MQ-9 Reaper, for example, or the MQ-1, its older predecessor, it's a very short leap to essentially arm strikes. And in a lot of cases on what we call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, a lot of these UAVs, these drones, will be armed. And these are the kinds of, these models of drones that carry armament. So I think it's an academic argument.
Do you think they will be used to launch strikes against targets as they become known?
I don't think anything is going to happen without the consent and the approval of the Nigerian government. We stepped forward, the U.S. State Department stepped forward to to Niger directly and said, look, can we do this? And they consented. They said yes. And by the way, this isn't one particular case. This is part of a larger security agreement between the U.S. and between the U.S. and Niger. So we're not talking about an isolated case of building one drone base and launching surveillance drones. I mean, I think for that's the understanding.
Sorry, I need to push you on this
implicit
point, because we know that drones and drone strikes are the weapon of choice for the Obama administration. And when you say, nothing will happen without Niger's consent, well, there's been plenty of drone strikes in Pakistan and Afghanistan on the face of it without the consent of those governments.
Well, yes. I mean, I certainly, if the U.S. State Department says our intent is not to launch armed strikes at the moment, then that's, I think we can take their word for it. But then, you need to look at what the rest of AFRICOM is doing. And, for example, Djibouti and former Ambassador Shen will be able to tell you that, at least 30% of the air operations conducted on that base in Djibouti are armed drone missions, something between 16 and 20 launches and recoveries every day. And that's part of the reason why we started to hear about some of the mishaps, crashed drones, virus problems, things of that nature, because the tempo of operations was so high in Djibouti. And I think that's really one of the reasons why AFRICOM is looking to shift operations further into the continent, because Djibouti is simply overwhelmed with drone flight operations at the moment. So again, the focus for the past year or two has obviously been Yemen and parts of the Middle East, and Seychelles and Djibouti were ideal launching points for those operations. But now the U.S. obviously is very keen to keep an eye on what's going on in North Africa and the Maghreb, now that we've seen the situation develop.
Noel, I mean, this is clearly one of the controversies of the use of drones, and there is going to be a problem if the US wants to move on from using them in a purely surveillance operation to actually using them to conduct strikes.
I think your previous speaker is absolutely right. I mean, I can't take the word of people saying we're not going to use armed drones, since the United States policy for a very long time has been we neither confirm nor deny it. In fact, it's not confirmed in the US courts, because people from Reprieve who are trying to get prosecutions going from families in the Yemen have been told that there's no official it's not been accepted officially that there are actually drone strikes there, and certainly not by the CIA. But it's not just the strikes themselves, you see, because once there's one or two strikes, I mean, there's been a report by Reprieve and a report by Stanford Law and NYU universities in the United States looking at the kind of stress levels that people are suffering, because you have 3 or 4 drone strikes and then you have surveillance all the time overhead, and this is terrifying children and families who don't know if it's surveillance or if suddenly there's going to be a missile appearing out of it. I know that in the Yemen there are children who are not going to school now because they don't want to be seen in any kind of grouping in case that grouping is misinterpreted. So it's a pretty awful thing, spreading out these drones. I mean, I can see that you want them for force protection, but you've really got to think about what you're doing here and think really, really hard.
Just on that subject, in fact, the UN is to investigate the use of drone strikes at the request of several nations, including Pakistan. Ben Emerson, a UN Special Rapporteur, will look into the extent of civilian casualties and the legality of the strikes. And he said this to reporters: one of the fundamental questions is whether aerial targeting using drones is an appropriate method of conflict where the individuals are embedded in a local community. Noel, this was your point, wasn't it, that there is a big question over whether drone strikes are legal under international law?
Yes, well, Philip Alston, who was the former Special Rapporteur for extrajudicial killings for the UN, brought this before the General Assembly in 2010, and he was essentially told these are US covert operations and it was none of his business. So he came back in November of the same year with a 30-page report explaining exactly why it breached humanitarian law, but that was buffed off as well. And Harold Coe, who's the chief lawyer for Hillary Clinton, was Hillary Clinton, has said that Well, you shouldn't worry because the United States is obeying all applicable laws, he can assure us. And I'm not sure that he can assure us of anything of the sort.
David, we've talked about the downside of drone strikes, and I completely take the point that in this case we're talking about surveillance drones, but where they are used for strikes, the Obama administration is saying that they are very successful. They've had success in taking out several high-level al-Qaeda and Taliban figures, and that the collateral damage, if you like, the civilian deaths are very, very low.
Well, clearly there have been cases where they have been successful and they have taken out some very nasty people. I think in the context of this conversation, dealing with a deal that is still the details of which are being worked out with the government of Niger, it has been made very clear we're talking about surveillance only. And I think it's premature to escalate that to the use of armed drone strikes. When and if that happens, then I think the conversation ought to go in that direction. But so long as this is just a surveillance issue, I think it's a very different argument.
So how far do you see U.S. involvement in this region then?
I'm sorry, say again, please.
How far do you see U.S. involvement expanding in this region?
Well, it's already expanded fairly significantly from the days of counterterrorism training, a program that dates back to the 2005 to 2008 period, where the U.S. military did a lot of training, including in Mali, some $37 million worth. That doesn't seem to have helped very much. Also a number of aid projects that were designed to try to make life better for Malians. So we've gone from that to now the turboprop operations out of Ouagadougou, and there was one out of Mauritania earlier. Now we're talking about a drone surveillance operation out of Niger. The United States military is providing refueling capacity for French military aircraft over Mali, and also transporting both French military personnel and military equipment into Mali. I do not see U.S. troops, combat troops on the ground. The only footprint, I think, will be an operation for maintaining a drone surveillance base and also training personnel, but not combat troops on the ground.
Do you agree with that, Robert? No combat troops on the ground from the U.S.?
Well, I think the U.S. has become very good at creating an appropriate lexicon of language for uniformed and non-uniformed special operations personnel, in various parts, in various regions like these. For example, in Djibouti, there are some 300, we think, special operations task force personnel flying intelligence services agencies missions to parts of the Middle East and Africa. And these, again, are the missions that have oversight and have transparency to the executive branch, to the president's office, who in many cases makes decisions himself. So I think, again, we're having an academic conversation about things that we tell the American public. At the end of the day, there are parts of the military that don't have visibility of other parts of other agencies and maybe semi-military organizations that the U.S. has that don't have visibility of what they're doing. Same with special task force operations out of Djibouti. The U.S. Air Force, for example, has no oversight of what's going on there. They can't tell you who's running the operation, what their real names are. And again, that is knowledge that has been denied to the press as well. So then to turn that microscope on Niger in this particular case and Burkina Faso, where they're discussing and trying to negotiate access for a drone base, I think it can be almost a circular investigation, because we're not necessarily going to find out who's running the operations, if they're uniformed or not. And again, this comes back to a very clear division line, and I want to make this very clear, that there's a difference between overt, unclassified drone missions that are flown every day in places like Afghanistan by NATO personnel from various countries, and the other types of drone missions which are authorized, funded, and executed by the intelligence services, and again have visibility to the executive branch. Very different types of missions. They often stray into each other and use the same resources, but again, I think what we're going to see is, for initially the types of missions that we see being flown out of Niger, the military simply won't have access to those. We won't have visibility.
It all sounds slightly chaotic, Robert. Noel, I saw you nodding during that, and this comes back to your point about different departments operating different equipment for different reasons.
Yes, there's quite a difference between conventional forces using surveillance drones to protect themselves and see who's sneaking up on them, etc., than a covert organisation like the CIA flying out and assassinating people, with what they call targeted killings. In fact, the targeted killings in the Yemen, for instance, have spread now to be what they call signature strikes. So they're looking for people loading things onto trucks. And this is quite a different thing than the conventional forces. And I think your previous speaker was very right to draw that line, because I think it's a very confusing message to the public as well, where there's a lot of talk about protecting our lads out on the front, when in actual fact it's nothing to do with that. It's actually, well, it's arguably creating a lot more terrorism back at home.
OK, let's just have a look at some of the responses we've had to this issue on our Facebook page. Tamrat Dejani says, terrorism is everyone's concern. We have to mitigate it by whatever means. Ceres Nebuka says, armed drones are a great shame to me, a US citizen. Anita Cuts simply says, leave Africa the hell alone. David, what do you think is going to be the overall response to the expanded US presence in that region?
Well, if you're speaking particularly about northern Nigeria and Boko Haram, and I was in northern Nigeria earlier this month, there clearly is a great deal of confusion as to who or what Boko Haram is. It does seem to be, at least up to the present time, an indigenous northern Nigerian movement which does have some contact with these other groups, including al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. But its objectives seem to be designed internally for Nigeria. I don't see that a U.S. drone operation in Niger or anywhere else in the region is going to have much impact, if any, on what's going on with Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. But I certainly do see the effort as expanding beyond Mali. I think that there is a concern that AQIM and organizations like the Movement for Oneness and Jihad in West Africa are of a threat to international interests generally, not just Western interests, but international interests and the interests of African governments. And it will take that into account as it does its surveillance.
Isn't there evidence that these various organizations are actually collaborating? They're sharing funding and recruiting efforts and weapons and expanding their ideology?
Well, I think there clearly is some collaboration. I don't have the details of it, and I'm not sure that anyone does, but there's enough evidence out there to suggest that meetings have taken place. Maybe there's been some cross-training involved, and it's a bit of a scary situation, and that's why I think the surveillance part of this is entirely merited. I have concerns, too, about military drone strikes in this region. I'm not a great fan of that, but I think for surveillance purposes, this is the ideal approach.
And Robert, do you agree with that this is, David calls it a scary situation which merits surveillance drones? Is there, well, of course there is, a growing concern that there are groups in this area who are posing a threat to national security?
Well, I think, again, we need to be really clear about what French troops are keen to protect in the area. And this is primarily energy, oil, natural gas, in places like Nigeria and Algeria. France and the US are both in the top 5 consumers of energy products from this region. So that's what we're talking about.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you to all my guests for taking part in today's conversation. Robert Densmore, David Shin and Noel Sharkey. Don't forget, if you want to send us your feedback, then you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story or email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For the moment, from me, Shiri Ghosh. Bye for now.